one of the big problems that one has in trying to talk about this with people is that there's certain words that are taboo now because of the influence of rationalist or reductionist science. And those words are spirit, soul, the unconscious, the feminine, and anything else that puts the hackles up of the rational mind and who says, this is a load of rubbish and I don't know what you're talking about. But I go on my own life experience, on my writing, which has been all about the feminine principle, and my understanding of the alchemists, what they were on about. They were not just turning base metal into gold, they were actually transforming their consciousness. And they knew they were doing this, and they knew or discovered that they were divine by the work that they did. They realized that they were part of the extraordinary thing that they were exploring in their vessels. So the question is how to get across to people who really shut off when you bring up these subjects, how to get across that there is another way of looking at everything. And the answer is you can't. You're up against a brick wall. And until some life experience, like, for instance, the loss of a parent or a child, really shakes them to the foundations of their being, they're not going to ask questions. They're not going to really be sufficiently fragile to be able to ask questions. They'll be in a defensive position against discussing any of these questions. Nevertheless, you can persevere, and I think Ken Wilber's thought is very helpful here because he divides the evolution of our consciousness into different levels on a convenient chart. And he says that generally the population of the whole world has reached level 4. After that, you have level 5, which is the Enlightenment level of the 18th century, when science and the rational mind began to come in. Then you have level 6, which is the environmental movement and the awareness that we are part of the environment that we live in and that we have to respect it. But the problem is that level 4 has absolutely no comprehension of what level 6 is talking about. So if level 6 tries to talk about the soul or the spirit or the feminine, level 4 shuts down and says, I don't want to hear about it. There's no such thing as spirit and there's no such thing as God. Get rid of God, get rid of the soul, and we're left just with the rational mind. But the rational mind is like the emperor with no clothes, doesn't know it yet. Somebody has to tell the emperor that he has no clothes, and eventually the penny will drop. I find that chart very helpful because it's a waste of breath to try and bring people round or convert people to your way of thinking. Conversion does not work in this world. You have to ask people questions. What do you value most in your whole life? Do you value your child or your dog or your environment or your work? What is it that you give the highest value to? And just ask them the question and leave the question with them. They don't have to answer. They're not obliged to answer. I've worked in solitude for 20 years writing my book, The Dream of the Cosmos, not expecting that anybody will understand it, but hoping that it will reach a few, because it's written for the few. And in fact, the alchemists and the hermeticists who worked in great danger of being hauled up before the Inquisition, they worked in the same sort of secrecy, same sort of retirement or withdrawal from the world. And you have to withdraw from the world in order to do this kind of work and to get in touch with soul and with spirit. You can't do it in the marketplace. You can't do it on Facebook and Twitter. You have to give up a certain amount of engagement in the world in order to become capable of listening. And listening is a faculty that's totally missing in our world because nobody listens to either soul or spirit because they believe that they don't exist. So there's no wisdom coming into the world. Governments have no wisdom. They have a great deal of bureaucratic skill, but they do not have wisdom. And you can see it in the way that they're handling the situations in the world today. Something is missing. And you can't go very long without being aware of the absence of soul and of spirit and of needing to bring them back. The most important thing to be aware of when you're speaking about the word feminine is that it does not refer only to women. What it refers to is a totally different perspective on life, which is a sacred perspective. So men and women are involved in this equally. It's not something that's unique or special for women. It's not something that men need to be frightened of. But I think one needs to understand something very difficult in the modern world, which is the rise of women and the feminist movement, which is very aggressive from a male point of view, very frightening and alarming, because men really don't know how to relate to women who are in a state of almost possession by the masculine archetype as they're trying to improve the status of the feminine. So they become more masculine, more yang, and they forget their yin nature because they've been educated with men. They've been educated to copy the male model of achieving goals, and they feel they have to do this. Their education now is programmed to make them, like men, behave like men, and men no longer know what to do because there are no women to relate to, in the sense that someone who could hold their feeling values and who would listen to them rather than try and be their rival. And all this is very distressing for relationships between men and women, because men don't even know now whether they should open the door for a woman or give her a pat on the back. They don't even touch her body now. It's just ridiculous. It's become out of proportion. And what has been lost is the fact that men carry within them, in their deeper nature, more in touch with their feeling values in their heart. They carry the feminine value within them, and it's been responsible for their greatest achievements. Everything that they've done for the world has been done from their heart, from the feminine principle within them, and from being in touch with their soul. And everything that is now being done, not everything, but a great deal of the thrust, really, towards new technology is being driven by men who are out of touch with their hearts. When the feminine value is not recognized as this different perspective that I've tried to explain, when we're not in touch with soul and with spirit, then the energy of life becomes dominated by the will to power. And we can see that will to power in the nuclear weapons situation. We can see it in the drive for robotics and artificial intelligence, which has great dangers, but the men who are driving this are not aware of the dangers, or not sufficiently aware of them, and they're not in touch with their hearts. They're absolutely dominated by this rational mind and where it can take them. So this is shadow, and you find the shadow in politics, which is the will to power in the politicians, which we can see every day. And you see it in the Security Council, which can't work because it's always blocked by those who are trying to maintain the greatest position of power. Wherever you look, it comes in, and you see it tragically, really, in women's drive for more power in order to be equal with men, not realizing that they carry the greatest treasure in their own nature, which is the heart values, which they need really to support and strengthen, rather than copying the model of the very driven men who live in the culture. What has happened is that people are becoming more and more stressed because of this constant striving to be better or more successful or more rich or more powerful. And then we have mental illness in our culture. Nobody asks where this mental illness is coming from, which is being given so many treatment with drugs, which in itself can be harmful. And it's coming from the stress of trying to live in a culture which is unbalanced, and where men and women, neither of them know their true value, and neither of them can therefore relate to each other through the true value that they hold, but through a false value that's been imposed on them by all sorts of intellectual discussions and beliefs and cultural constructs which have been imposed on them as children. Even at 5 years old, children are being told about gender differences, which is far too young for them to be told about that. They can't possibly know what adults are trying to talk about. And they won't know till they get into their teens, when they're beginning to have the capacity to decide, do I want to be a man or a woman? And it gets sucked into our culture by the media, who make a big thing of it, and then everybody begins to copy it. And then governments say, well, you've got to teach it in schools, and so on and so on. But this is all shadow. It's all about will to power underneath. It is shadow activity, trying to get your view across, trying to force your view onto schools in order to be modern. And it's really very, very dangerous for the psyche of the child. As a grandmother, I'm speaking, I now have a 22-year-old grandson, but seeing him grow up in this culture and trying to protect him from this infection, really, of what goes on in schools and with Facebook and all the things that children are now doing to each other, that is all because we have the false values directing the culture, and because we're out of touch with the heart values and the soul and the direction of spirit, because spirit could tell us what we're doing wrong and how we need to correct ourselves. So there's a lot involved here in the shadow, and we really need to look at it. There's a shadow of science, which wants to push its own beliefs, because they are beliefs. They're not always proven with scientific experiment. Secondly, the shadow of religion. We see it with ISIS, but we also see it in the fundamentalist religions in America. Wherever you want to have a point of view forced through on the people as being right, and God says this, God says that, you can be sure it's shadow. Shadow exists because we're not aware of it, so it kind of takes us over. But it starts probably in childhood with childhood experiences. It starts with what we're told by our parents, what we learn at school is the way to behave or the way not to behave. And we have to repress very vital elements in ourselves to do with our own passionate, creative nature, have to be cut off or curtailed or punished if we do wrong, or not encouraged. And all that goes into what Jung called the shadow. And later on, as we grow up, that creates a lot of anger. Anger is held in many people's consciousness in the shadow aspect of themselves. They're not aware of it. And for instance, I'm going to take Prince Harry as an example. After the death of Princess Diana, he had to bury his grief because as a man he didn't dare show it. It wasn't allowable that he should burst into tears or show his grief or express it in any way. And he went to a psychotherapist and worked it through. But if he hadn't gone to a psychotherapist, it might well have come out in a real burst of anger with somebody. He might have hit somebody, he might have even hit somebody he loves. That is how shadow, unacknowledged, takes hold of the psyche and can build up like a festering sore within until it bursts out in some form of violence or destructive behavior. So it's not all bad. It only becomes bad when it's neglected and repressed and denied the ability to express very creative and natural feelings. But for instance, if you've had a very indoctrinated childhood in which you're only allowed to say something or not say something, you will have cut off a good part of your nature. And that part of your nature will insist on being heard eventually, possibly in some act of violence against somebody you love, a wife or a child, or even in an act of war against somebody. So it's something that we need to be very gentle with in trying to understand it, not shut it off as something bad. It's something that hasn't been allowed to live and hasn't been recognized. And with that goes the whole experience of the heart that had to be shut down because the rational mind's control over all that has been absolute. And I hope I've made that really clear. It's a natural part of ourselves, but has been distorted or injured, if you like, or traumatized in some people's cases. And therefore it comes out as violence. And as I say, somebody who's lost a parent in childhood, a little 4 or 5-year-old who's lost his mother, can't hold the grief that he feels. And so it's buried and it could come out if he has no opportunity to talk about it with other people, which thankfully now we have with so many psychotherapists in the culture. But it may come out as rage later on. Rage that his mother was taken away from him, and that why was this? Why was God so cruel to take his mother away? Or why was life so cruel? So buried feelings are the origin of shadow, if you like. What we've reached, which I think is quite clear, we've reached a tipping point. We can't go any further down the path we're on without destroying the environment which sustains us, and without destroying a huge part of the beauty of the world. And it just needs one nuclear explosion to destroy a huge part of the world, as well as millions of people and the whole life involved in that. This would be a crime on such a scale as to be absolutely unimaginable. Even the thought of Kim Jong-un dropping a hydrogen bomb in the Pacific is an outrageous infringement of the sacredness of the planet. And this is something that, if we are to get beyond this tipping point, if we are to change our behavior, we really have to be aware of our shadow behavior and of all the things that have led to this situation. We have to take responsibility for it, and at the same time have compassion for ourselves, because it's not entirely our fault. This has been part of the indoctrination of thousands of years, have brought us to this point. It's not that we've been possessed by some evil genie or evil entity in the universe. It's something that's built up century by century, year by year, until we've become unable to recognize the full horror of what we've created. And we really have the ability to change this pattern, to heal ourselves and thereby heal the world. We have to start with ourselves as individuals, as I said, with compassion, with love, with understanding, with talking about all this, for God's sake. We need to talk with each other. We need to bring all these things out of the shadow and not build a brick wall of defense against them, but have some pity on the life that we belong to, and some love for it. Because really that has to take primacy now. It's love rather than power.